All right, so we're not going to go through too many slides today, but we're just going to have a quick introduction to React. Again, very new concept or syntax or a whole bunch of things coming with React. So let's kind of just take it step by step. I think studies have shown that usually the beginning part of a lecture and probably the end part of a lecture are the most memorable, as in people remember the material the most. So I'm going to start off with a general PSA that might not make sense right now, but I just want to instill it in everyone. So the public service announcement here is do not manually edit state and prop values. Now, I know that probably means nothing to you guys right now, but I just want you guys to remember this because it's very important when you're coding with React. So again, state and prop values, we're going to talk about those more going forward, but just keep this like stamped in your head. Do not manually edit state and prop values. All right, we'll get back to this notion in a bit. All right, so the first question you guys might have is, what is React? Great question to ask. So React is a JavaScript library for developing quick and efficient UIs on the web. It's actually developed by Facebook. It is open source. And main terminology I want to drop here is that we're going to be creating and using something called components. All right, so your next likely question might be, what are components or what is a component? I describe them as basically fancier HTML tags. So they're user defined, as we're going to be creating our own components, and they act effectively like HTML tags. But again, there's more to them than just simple HTML logic, I guess. So in this case, I have a quick example where we define some variables. So I have a variable of count, a variable of desk, and I have those values, and I return something that kind of looks like HTML. Here I have something called Oscar Platoon, which is my component. So this is an Oscar Platoon component, and I have some properties here I'm setting. I'm setting student count and description as those values that I had before. So this is using something called JSX. JSX, if you want to just think about it simply, is a marriage language using the syntax of JavaScript and HTML. So if you look at the example I have here, kind of looks like HTML when I'm returning here. I have these angle brackets. I have a tag or a component name, and then I have some attributes or properties that I'm setting. Right, this kind of looks very familiar to HTML, but we're also using JavaScript here, and this is essentially what JSX is. It's using a special syntax that lets you use JavaScript with HTML kind of hand in hand. So it's very easy to develop HTML pages using this. One of the key benefits of React is that it allows for easy reusability. So essentially what we're going to be doing with our development is we're creating components that we're going to reuse within our websites. So this goes back to our OOP discussions from week 2 and 3, if you remember, where we want to create objects that are easily blueprinted, and we can create copies as many times as we need and reuse that code really quickly rather than having to rewrite the same code over and over and over. We kind of create templates or blueprints that we could make use of as needed. What questions do you guys have about any of the topics here?
So does that tag, is that whole thing a component, or is it just that first? I'm assuming that's going to be a class.
Yeah, so Oscar Platoon here would be your component. And then what you're returning is, I guess, an instance of that component. So again, if we go back to our OOP discussions where you have a class, the class in that case would be Oscar Platoon. And then we're creating an instance of Oscar Platoon, of the Oscar Platoon component, where we're returning it here. So this is a snippet. This is not, this is going to be within another component, but we'll see this in play when we get to coding. But kind of just understand that we're going to be using JSX, which is going to be that weird syntax that we're not used to. But this is an example of using JSX. All right. So before we get into it, I just want to highlight this. This is some bit of, I guess, struggle with learning React is that we're going to learn React kind of in 2 different syntax buckets. One is called functional-based components, and the other is class-based components. These are 2 different ways to create the same logic for your React components. As you might guess, functional-based components uses functions, and I guess I forgot to add components here. Class-based components uses classes. So we're familiar with functions and classes from Python. We can create classes in JavaScript. That's something we've not covered before, but we're going to cover that today. But just understand that there's two different ways to do the same exact thing. And that's kind of, as I mentioned, some struggle or some frustration. It's like, okay, you're learning something new. It's going to be harder to learn something new, but doing it two different ways, right? The reason why we teach both is because functional-based components are kind of the way of the future. I think the React, React gurus or the people that kind of set the standards to React, they've made a decision. I think our curriculum page mentions it, like I think a couple years ago, to kind of move towards functional-based components. So that's kind of the present toward the future. You're going to see more and more functional-based components in React code, but class-based components were kind of the way of the past / current. So we're in that transition phase where you might see either, like if you get, tossed a React project that you're working with, you might see functional-based components or class-based components. So it's important to understand both, the structure of both, but also understand they're accomplishing the same exact thing. It's just two different ways to go about doing it. So we're going to be going over both. We're going to make sure that we understand the syntax, but hopefully as you're seeing one, eventually you should get to the point. I'm not saying right now. You should get to the point where if you see a function-based component, you should be mentally able to restructure it to a class-based component, just visually in your head. So we're going to be going over both during this week. All right, so again, throwing a lot of slides at you, it's going to be much better to see code. So let's actually create our first React app. All right, and these are the commands you want to run to create React-based app. Sorry, I probably should add in, I think we need to get into our directory here. All right, sorry about that. All right, let's get that going again. All right, so if you want to, please code along with me. So we're going to create our first React app. So we're going to run npx in our terminal. We're going to run npx create -react-app. It must be this command. And then your app name, it can be whatever app name you want. There are some limitations on the formatting of your app name. I don't think it have underscores. You guys can try it with underscore. There's some limitation. I think you got to use lowercase also. Don't quote me on that, but create your own app name, get into that folder, and then you want to run npm start, and then we'll do this together and see what happens. All right. So I'm going to go over to my terminal. I'm actually just going to bring up a VS Code window. I might regret that, so let me not do that. Let's just create a folder, make dir. Let's call it my first React app. I'm going to cd into that and then open a VS Code there. All right, so I just created a folder, opening a VS Code in that location. And then I'm going to use my terminal in my VS Code. So there's my VS Code. Sorry, let me make that brighter. Okay, that should be bright enough. All right, so I'm going to open a terminal. I'm going to try to go slow. So if I'm going too fast, just say, hey, I need a second to catch up, and I'll gladly pause for a second or two. All right, so just a blank VS Code inside of a folder. In here, I'm going to run npx create React. Let me blow this up a little bit. Create React app, and then I'm going to give it an app name. I have two options here. Similar to Django, I can give it an app name such as, my cool app. This will create a nested folder. Or I could just use a period here, and I'll create a React app within my current folder here. So let's do it both ways. I'm just going to go with my cool app as my first app here. So I'm going to run that. This is going to actually take a moment. So I know when we're doing a pip install of Django, it took maybe 5 or so seconds. This will take probably a good 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds. So always a good chance to reflect on life, ask the questions you want to ask yourself in your head. But this will take a few seconds here.
I think it's a few minutes instead of a few seconds.
Yeah, it might take maybe a minute. Depends probably on your internet speed. It's downloading a bunch of libraries for React.
You have to
So-
do this every time when you start a new React project?
That is correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
it can take a while.
yeah. So while it's taking a while, any questions thus far? Is everyone able to run npx create React app and then again an app name? So if you give it an app name, it's going to create a folder. If you just do a period there, it's going to not have a nested folder. So in this case, right now it's still downloading stuff. Does anyone run into errors? Hopefully we could have someone deal with errors if you guys run into that.
I have a question regarding like the period and everything with the nested folders. Do you think it's harder to like kind of navigate that when you having a nested folder versus not having a nested folder?
I would say it's strictly up to the developer. If you want a nested folder, that go for it. Usually if you remember what I just did here, I created my own folder in my other terminal here. So instead of creating your own folder first, you could just do that by doing npx create React app and then the folder name. Or in this case, if I already created my own folder on my own, I'd probably just do npx create React app and then period, because I just want that in my folder that I just created. So it's up to you. There's no wrong way to go about it. If you want to have a nested folder, that's it's all up to you. Okay.
Cool, thank you.
Yep. So after a minute or an hour or however long it took, again, hopefully everyone has decent internet speeds, so it shouldn't take too long. You should see something that looks similar to this. Let's bring up this console. Just it's a description of what it did, downloaded some items, got maybe some warnings here that I might need to look into. But eventually you should see something called that says happy hacking, which means everything installed successfully and you should be good to go. Also tells you some prompts you could run, npm start, npm build, test, and so forth. All right, so let's actually take a look at what we got in our directory. So I'm gonna bring down my terminal. All right, let's explore our files. So my app is called my-cool-app. In here, we're gonna see a bunch of files. A couple things I want to point out here. We have something called package.json. This is very similar to when we did pip freeze and wrote out requirements.txt. That is essentially what package.json and package-lock.json are doing for us. This is showing the libraries we're using. So in this case, we have React installed. We have React DOM, React scripts, and some other items here too. All right, so package.json is what you're going to be essentially using to track what libraries you're using with your project. All right, so this is, again, very similar to when we did pip freeze and wrote out requirements.txt. This is the equivalent for JavaScript. All right, and then we also have package.lock. This one you should never manually edit. Package.json, you could add in libraries. Package.lock, you should never touch manually. That's kind of auto-generated for you. In fact, if you delete it, it'll be recreated for you when you run the project. All right, so again, a lot of items in here. I'm not gonna go through it line by line. You can kind of scan it. If you have a question, maybe Google it, but it's just a whole list of things that React is gonna use to understand your project. All right, so in this case, we're using version 17.0.2 of React. Hopefully that is the latest version. If we quickly check React's latest version. So reactjs.org is the main site for React. Again, you can find many other reference sites, but this is the site. So it looks like, yep, 17.0.2 is the latest version. So that's good to see that that's what we're using. So that's the version listed here. We also have React DOM and some other libraries. All right, so looking more into my project here, we notice we have a node modules folder. If you guys remember from our JavaScript development days, this is just the actual code for the libraries that we're going to be using. So this is a giant folder that has many folders within it. I'm not going to look through it. I'm just going to trust that everything that I downloaded is in node modules, and that's the libraries that are going to be run here. All right. So as always, you don't want to include node modules in your Git project. So the fortunate thing is when you create a React project, a Git Ignore is automatically created for you. That's going to have a few items that it's just going to automatically ignore. So one of those is going to be the node modules folder. All right, so it should not be part of your Git project. There's a few other items. I'm not even sure what .pnp is. I'm just going to trust this that React knows what it's doing. So again, you're going to ignore some items by default. Again, you can add to this if you want to, but kind of trust what they're ignoring. Unless you have a reason to not ignore something, just kind of leave this untouched. All right, but the main points of interest are two folders here. We should have a public folder and an SRC folder. Hopefully you guys have this in your project also. If not, then there might have been some issues installing React. Let's look at these folders and see what's in them. First thing is I'm going to open up public. What's in public? So the main point of interest here is index.html. This is a pre-coded HTML file. You really don't need to edit this. This is just kind of how your website will be generated. All right, the main point of interest is the SRC folder. This is where we're going to be doing our development. All right, so there should be a few files in here. We have index.js. This is your main entry point into your application versus public. Index.html is your main web page. All right, so index.html, we have index.js. We also have index.css. So these are your three files that we should be familiar with. HTML is your document structure, CSS are your stylings, and JS is your application logic. What questions you guys have about any of these files that we mentioned? Okay, so I'm just going to close the public folder. Again, I'm not going to touch anything in my public folder. That's going to remain unchanged, but we are going to edit some items in our SRC folder eventually. So if we look at index.js, let me bring that up. We have this blob of text, like 4 or 5 lines of code. Let's actually talk about it. So the way you actually use JSX, or I guess React components, is you will render them via a method called render. Right? This is going to take in JSX. So this is JSX that I've highlighted. And it's going to render that to your web page. Again, you don't want to touch anything in index.js. You can kind of just leave that as is. But the main component I want to highlight here is something called app. This app is like your topmost component for your React app. It's your application, right? So that is, that's a component. Again, look at the structure of it. We give it the component name and we surround it with tag with angle brackets, just like we would any HTML tag or element that we work with. But this is actually using an app component that's defined in our app file. So if you look in your list of files, you should see something called app.js. So again, React is a JavaScript library, so all of your logic is going to be written in JavaScript or JSX, but JSX is just going to be boiled down to JavaScript when it's compiled. So JSX is kind of like magical JavaScript that merges with HTML syntax, but in reality, it is JavaScript in the backend.
So what's the difference between that and TypeScript?
I'm not familiar enough with TypeScript to comment on that, but
So yeah, I can answer that. So JSX, think of JSX as Jinja 2 for Python. So in Python, you have HTML that you can inject JavaScript or Python into. JSX is very similar, but you can just inject JavaScript into. Now, what's the difference between the difference between TypeScript and JavaScript? TypeScript is essentially a JavaScript, except that you have to manually declare the type of every single JavaScript data type. It just TypeScript just allows for less errors.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. Again, I've not worked with TypeScript, but I think based on what Tom said, and I guess the little I've read before, if you work with strongly typed languages like C++, that's something I developed. That's where TypeScript kind of adds more security. Whereas in JavaScript, you can kind of do a whole list of things, and it's not you can have uncaught errors and create a variable that stores anything. TypeScript makes it a little more formal, where you say, all right, I'm going to store an int into this variable as opposed to anything that I want to store here. So it just makes it a little safer, I think, to develop. But again, I'm not developed with TypeScript, so I'll leave that discussion to the experts or to Google. All right, so again, looking at our index.js, we should see something called app. This is a component. Again, we got to import it. So just remember your imports when you're working with JavaScript. But that's coming from a file called app. So if you go to app.js, this is basically the main starting point for your React app. So app, this is a component. Notice it's defined as a function. So this is an example of a function-based component. All right, so again, just kind of pay attention to the syntax. We have, creating a function, app takes in no arguments, and the body of app is surrounded with these curly brackets. Within that, we have one return statement. So all this function is doing, maybe make it, we have a lot written here, but essentially we have a function called some component. And that's just returning something. All right, this is essentially what this is, but this something that we're returning is a giant JSX blob. So again, let's kind of read it together. We have a div. So we're using HTML in here, but again, this is JSX. Well, we could write HTML syntax and also inject JavaScript into it. So we have a div, again, from our HTML days, that's just a divider. This has a class name of app. One thing I could point out right now, we have something called class name. Why are we using class name instead of class? So if you remember, let me bring up a new file just for fun. Let's say blah.js, or sorry, not JS. Rename that to blah.html. And this isn't actually part of my project, so I'm just going to drag that kind of out here. All right, so normally when we're writing HTML as an HTML refresher, HTML, when we create something, let's say I'm creating a div, normally we give that a class name of, red font. If I want to use a CSS styling of red font, I could create a class, and then in my CSS file, let's create a CSS file, blah.css, right? I'd give a definition for a red font. If I want to create a class of red font, I'd say color equals red, right? Any questions on CSS or HTML here? So we use class to define a CSS class. But in JSX, very important to remember that you need to use class name instead of class. Why is that? Because the reason is because in JavaScript, there's a predefined keyword of class. All right, so class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, so you can't use that for an HTML class. Does that make sense?
I have a question.
Yep.
Is there an equivalent of, I guess, ID name, or is it just specifically class name?
You can do ID. So ID is not a reserved JavaScript name. So you can still use ID just like before in HTML. So if I want to give an ID, let's say, parent div is the ID of it. Yeah, again, essentially you're writing HTML, but it's not really HTML. Again, it's JSX, so it looks very, very similar to HTML. So here I'm writing, something that looks like HTML, that's fine. The main problem here, again, normally with HTML, you use something called class to define a CSS class. You can't use that same keyword in JSX because class has another meaning in JavaScript. So to kind of circumvent that, you need to use class name instead of class when you want to give a CSS class to a component or to a element. All right, so just remember class name instead of class when you want to create a CSS class within JSX.
Is class name case sensitive or no?
Yep, you must name it in this manner. Must be class lowercase and then uppercase n for class name. So this is using JavaScript, I guess, variable naming, where you have camel case starting with lowercase, and then every new word is capitalized. All right, so all this is doing is giving a CSS class name of app, if you want to stylize it. So if you go to our index.css, we could add some styling here for the app class. All right, sorry, we do have app.css, pardon me there. So we look at app.css, notice we have a .app class. This, again, is the class name that we gave it here. So again, instead of doing class equals app, we need to do class name equals app. Otherwise, it works the same way with CSS. All right, what questions do you guys have about CSS that we might have forgotten over the last few weeks? Okay, but notice there's some pre-generated styling in here, so we can kind of work off that. If we don't want it, we can obviously manipulate it. So as I mentioned, the src file, you're going to be wanting to interact with app.js and app.css. For the most part, I'm not saying this is a 100% rule. You don't really want to update index.js. This is should be more or less untouched because this is going to call your app component, and then whatever customized logic you want to do, you should do it in app.js. All right, so again, just kind of going through the return statement here. It's just a div. We're returning a div. That div has some child elements in it. We have a header, which is just like another dividing section. We have an image that we're showing here. Another part of the syntax is, again, similar to Jinja, as Tom mentioned. We had Jinja for Python. For JavaScript, we have JSX. So the syntax for using JavaScript within your JSX is by introducing curly braces. So here, we're going to have a variable or some object called logo. This is a JavaScript variable that we're injecting into our JSX here. All right, so logo is going to be some object. It's actually an image. So if you open up logo.svg, it's going to be some binary file that describes an image. I'm not actually sure what format this is. Might be vector format. I think that's what SVG is. Essentially, this is an image. I don't know if there's an easy way to see this in VS Code.
Not really.
Okay. Well, take my word for its image. We'll see this image shortly, but looking at the JS, so we have an image that we're rendering here. So the source is going to be that image. We have a class name, alt. We also have a paragraph tag that is just going to render some text. And then we have a link here. So again, most of it looks like HTML, but the important thing is we're injecting some JavaScript here. So in this case, we're opening an image, which is stored locally, and that's going to be the source of our image. So let's actually fire this up and get our first app running. So to do that, I'm going to bring up my terminal. Terminal is open. I need to make sure I'm within my folder. Since I have a nested folder, I'm going to go into that folder. So cd my cool app. So I want to be on this level. I'm going to get rid of my blah files so we don't confuse anyone. All right, I'm on this level. And now once you're on the level of your package.json, you want to run npm start. What this is actually going to do, if you look at package.json, there's a command for start. So it's actually going to run React scripts and start. That's what npm start is doing. It's running this command, and this is the value for it. All right, so if I run npm start, let's see what happens. Takes a second. Something's running on port 3. Oh, my bad. Let me kill my other server. Didn't realize I have a project open.
Question.
Yep, go for it.
Is this similar to the Django's version of like Python manage and then run server?
Yep, you got
Okay.
it. Yep, this is your React server that you're booting up. Sorry, I'm not sure what's using my port here. Give me one moment to find it. Yeah, I do definitely have a project running. So let me just go with yes. All right, so I launched my React server, but my React server is running at 3001. By default, the React port is 3000. So similar to Django, the default port is 8000. The default port here should be 3000, but in my case, I'm using something on that port, so I can't run that. Looks like I have an error. So similar to Django, you're going to be seeing helpful errors. So in this case, it's saying, hey, failed to compile. So I obviously have some code that it can't run. And it says, all right, function, some component, return something. So I'm going to need to get rid of this. All right, so if I get rid of that, and save that, my server should recompile. And notice once you have something successful, very similar to Django, when that server is good to go, you should see something like this. It says, now you can view my cool app. in your browser. And again, mine is running on port 3001 because my port 3000 seems to be occupied by some other app that I can't find on my machine right now. But otherwise, you should be able to go to that location it's telling you to. And okay, this is a great example. If you ever see something this gross on your screen, don't freak out. That's just like a blip in React. What this means is React just failed to kind of refresh appropriately. If you refresh your window, there you go. You should see something that looks like this as your first React tab. I'm going to pause here to make sure everyone's gotten to this point. But this is our index.js that's running. So index.js is our entry point. What this is rendering is something called app. That's a component. So if we look at our app component, it's rendering everything in here. We have an image. That image is this spinny thingy that's going around. We also have, this paragraph tag that we saw before. So paragraph tag, edit, and save to reload. That's that part. And then we also have a link here. So this will link you to reactjs.org, which is the official site for React. Did everyone make it to this point? Anyone having trouble getting this page running?
Yeah, I'm getting npm errors. It's not even letting me start the server.
npm errors. What error message does it come up with?
Basically the first line is code life cycle, and then the next line is ERR and 01, and then first React app dot or 0.1.0 start, React scripts start, then exit status 1.
Okay. Yeah, might need someone to assist you with that. My only suggestion right now is make sure you're on the same level as your package.json in your terminal, because that's where npm start is looking for. If you are on the same level as package.json and having issues, I'd say, yeah, we might need to take that offline, or one of the TAs might be able to assist you if they know how to fix the error you're dealing with. All right. Anyone else having trouble getting to this page on your own machine? Okay, I'm going to assume that everyone made it to this homepage. So again, this is a default.
It's just my AWS is acting slow because it's running low on memories, but that's something I'll figure out later. So I'll just watch the lecture for now so I don't get too far behind.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I don't have too much experience with the Cloud9 setup, but hopefully it's.
Yeah, it's just the memory. That's all it is, because it's just saying I'm using too much memory. So I probably got to go in and delete some stuff.
Gotcha. Okay. But yeah, so once you do get your React server running and you go to the port, the default port, in this case, mine is 3001, you should see this page. This is the introductory page. This is the default homepage, but this is something we can change. So, this is kind of cool looking, but that's not something I've done. I want to actually put something I do on the screen. So let's actually talk about how I can do that. So normally I just go into my app.js and let me minimize this. And I just delete this entire blob. So I don't want, I don't want to use their homepage. I want to create something of my own. So again, the bare bones here is you need a function, and that function needs to return something. That something you return needs to be JSX. So in this case, I can return something as simple as a header tag that says hello world, right? Again, this essentially looks like HTML. So you could kind of in your head say, okay, it's HTML, and I'm returning a header 1 tag. All right, and then as always, you need to export whatever you want to export out of this file. So that's should be there by default. But now if I save this, notice I didn't even have to refresh my page. That actually kind of automatically happened because I think, yeah. So I changed my logic here, and now my web page says hello world. All right, if I change anything else, it should automatically update. Another thing I want to highlight here, again, I know there's a lot of new concepts, a lot to take in. When you return something from a component, let's try returning something else and see what happens. So if I return a paragraph saying, this, say today is Monday. Gone. Okay. If I do this, you're gonna get some error. Notice that I have some red squigglies here. Hopefully you guys can see that on your end. The thing you gotta remember is when you're returning something, it must be one single element but that element can have nested elements. So in this case, I have two elements here, or two elements here that I'm returning. You can't do that with a component. The component must return one and only one element. So the easiest way and the common way to do this is you just nest it within a div structure. So if I create a div and then move this item here, now my component is returning exactly one element, and that element is a div element. Yes, there are some child elements within there, but there's one parent element that I'm returning. All right, so again, if you see those red squigglies, you should be able to hover over them. So if I get rid of this div, let's see what the tooltip says. It says JSX expressions must have one parent element. All right, so just keep that in mind. If you try to return more than one element, you need to have a surrounding parent element. Again, divs are not really going to take up any space. They're just kind of organizational blocks. So I add a div here. I save this. There we go. I get my today is Monday beyond message.
Can it have more than one div?
Yeah, you can have more than one div, but you need only one parent item. So if your question is, can I add a div here? The answer is yes. But now that I have a new div, so let's put a h1 goodbye world. If I have another div here, now I got to surround these two divs with another parent element. Again, usually divs are the way to go. You could use some other parent element. Like I could do a header tag, for example. Those are less common.
Could you use a body tag for it?
I don't think you want to use a body tag because your HTML, where is it? Your index.html already has a body tag. So I think that's actually gonna probably not do good things. We could try it, always worth trying, but I'm gonna say don't use a body tag there. Use a div. Pretty much 99% of the time, just use a div surrounding it. In this case, I use a header, which should be fine because the header is just glorified div. But now I got hello world, my paragraph, and then another div down here. Let's try using a body tag. I'm actually curious. I'm gonna guess it won't be okay, but maybe it will be. So I do a body, save that. All right, it works. So I guess you can have multiple body tags. I did not know that. Good. Always worth trying. You're never gonna, I'm not gonna say never, but you're most likely never gonna break your computer entirely by trying something coding wise.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But don't
HTML just doesn't care.
but don't use a body tag.
Yeah, just use divs. As I said, divs are the way to go. All right, so again, we're creating a component here. There's a component name is app. We're using a functional-based component. So again, I mentioned class-based components. That's just a different way to do the same exact thing. We'll get into class-based components shortly. Well, right now I just want to focus on understanding a basic React app here.
Ankur, quick question.
Yep.
Unlike Python, does the indent matter in this case, or is that just for readability?
Good question. Just for readability. So I could have some gross tabbing here. Yep, this is JavaScript, so tabbing doesn't matter. So if I do something like this, it shouldn't change my output one bit. Still got the same thing. Good question though.
Gotcha. Appreciate it.
Yep. All right, I'm gonna fix my tabbing though because it makes it easier to read. All right, so again, I have a parent div, I have a couple of child divs here, and then I have some HTML tags here. But again, one thing I want to mention, these are HTML tags. We talk about components. You can have components nested within components just the same way where you can have elements nested within elements, right? So if I go back to my index.js, these items are components. So I have a component here nested underneath another component. Notice that it's very similar to HTML where you need a closing tag if you have an opening tag. Some tags can be self-closing. So my app tag is both an opening tag and a closing tag because there's a slash before the angle bracket. So in the same way, you can create multiple components and nest them within each other. And that's kind of the way React should be structured. So I go back to my app.js. I have this blob here, which is what I'm rendering. What if I want to create another component, like a smaller subcomponent that I might want to reuse? So I have a couple of divs here. Let's say I want to make these divs into a separate component. How do we go about doing that? So
Would you have it as like another function that you call from inside of app?
Yep. So essentially, we're going to want to create another function. But I think, sorry, Jack, I might have given a yup to before I actually processed it. You do want to create another function, but normally you want to keep components separated in individual files. So in this case, I don't want to create a nested function. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call that, let's say, let's call it Oscar Platoon, because that's what I don't want to go that far, sorry. Let's call it just message.js. Couple notes on naming. For components, you want to use capital letters to start your naming. So looking at app starts with a capital A, it's a function name, but you want to start with a capital A. Normally JavaScript functions or naming, if you remember, is like some function, right? You use lowercase, usually for a function name in JavaScript. For components, you want to use a capital letter for the first item. So in this case, if some function were a component, I want to use a capital S, not a lowercase s. That's just naming conventions. That is not mandated, as in I could use a lowercase a here. It should work fine, but we're going to go with uppercase because that's the standard. All right, so I created a new file called message.js with a capital M. That's a naming convention. So in here, I'm going to create a new functional component. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is create a function. I'm going to call that message. Normally, you want to match the name of the file with the component you're creating. I don't see a reason why you want to deviate from that, but maybe you could come up with a case. All right, so this is simply a function, and I'm going to return something from this function. So I'm going to do return, and let's return H1 that says hello world. All right, we're going to change this a little bit later, but right now I just want to get something working. So export default message. All right, so a very, very simple component I created here. It's returning an H1 tag. Now, if I go back to my app.js, I'm going to import that component I just created. So if I do import from .current message, now it has something called message. So if I want to add a new line here, I can just do message here. And now I have a component within another component. So my app is a component. I've created my own component called message, and I'm just going to have that be rendered by adding it here. So let's say I get rid of this div. Now I have something called message, and I also have my previous div of goodbye world. So if I look at this and save it, I got a fail to compile, message not defined. That's not good. Message here, default message.
The way you're importing it is incorrect.
Importing.
Import message from message.
Oh,
So it'd be import.
yeah. Thank you. From. Okay, so we want to get an object here. So this is my component that I'm importing from this file. Thank you, Tom. So I get this message component. So I go here. All right, there we go. So we got hello world, goodbye world. Notice these look, they're both headers. One, I've manually created a div and an H1. The other, I've just created a component that has an H1 in it. So let's say I want to use that twice. I could have two messages, or I could have as many messages as I want. This is the reusability.
Sorry, can you slow down a bit, please?
Sure. So I just deleted my previous div. Now I'm just going to copy this message component that I have. And I'm just going to have that multiple times here. So let's say I have a message 4 times. This is the whole point of React, the reusability of it. So I have one component here. I'm rendering it 4 times. All right. So if I save this and I go back to my web page, notice I have 4 instances of that same component. I have hello world listed 4 times. It's because I'm using my message component 4 times in my JSX. All right. So this works. I'm getting the same message, but let's say I want to actually use a different message here. Like I don't want to write hello world each time. I actually want this to be maybe a little different for each instance. How do I go about doing that? And this is where we get to states and props. So remember I gave that PSA earlier. We're going to be talking about states and props a lot. So this can be sort of a difficult concept to kind of understand right off the bat. There are two items you just gotta kind of know about. There's some state values and prop values. States are external data that's passed down by parent components. All right, so if you have a component, if your parent component is passing you a value, that's called a state value. All right, just terminology, make sure you're familiar with it eventually. But state values are external data that's passed down from a parent component.
Anchor.
Sorry.
Those are reversed.
Yeah,
State
got it.
is. There you go.
Just realized that. Thank you. Add slides. All right.
Do you mind going back to the message.js, please?
Sure. All right. So sorry, I had to correct that. Apologies, but we'll get back to the slide. Let's go back to message.js. The message.js is a functional component. We create a function. We return some JSX from it. In this case, I'm returning just the H1 tag. That is hello world as its value. And then always remember to export your function or class-based component, wherever it may be.
Okay.
All right.
Let's see.
So going back to my slides now, corrected slides. Sorry. Go back.
Getting some weird errors.
Tell me about your errors, Stephen.
It says module build failed.
Does it show you any errors in your list?
Yeah, I think it's on the index.js.
Okay.
Let's see, what did I miss?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile kind of checking out the error. So I'm actually gonna, do you mind sharing your screen with us?
Sure thing, 1 second.
Okay, because again, errors are common, so you can kind of understand how React shows you errors and how we can go about fixing them. So I'll let Stephen share his screen. Let's see if we could fix this error. And I think it'd be a good example to go through error handling or debugging, I guess.
And a good chance to slow down.
Sure. Yeah, we'll take a break after this. Okay, so we see we're looking at Stephen's screen here. All right, so it's pointing to your return message line on line 5. So yeah, can you go back to your message.js?
Sure thing. Let me do something.
Yeah, so again, React is pretty good about showing you exactly where the error is. So it's pointing at line 5. So we look at your message.js line 5.
Your message file.
And you,
Oh,
All right, so we have export default message. That looks correct, but on line 5.
oh, you're missing parentheses for the return.
Oh, the parentheses are only needed if you go onto a multiple lines, so that should be fine. Yeah, I'm not sure.
App.js.
Try refreshing your browser. That's usually my.
okay.
There you go. Yeah. So again, React sometimes blips and just like can't recover from an error. So if all else fails, just try refreshing your browser, and that might fix it. Yeah, your code looked fine. So I think that's just a React particular issue where sometimes.
Oh, okay. I understand. So if there's an error, it won't like do the auto updating till you manually update it.
No, it will. Usually it should refresh for you. So if you change your code and save it, the React server should kind of refresh and run it. But sometimes I'd say like 5% of the time, it can't recover from that error. And they'll just show you like a really garbage message that's not actually the error it's encountering.
Okay.
So in that case, like if you tried a few things like, hey, my code's right, just hit a quick refresh on your web page, and that might solve or resolve the error that React is claiming to have found.
I always just get in the habit of refreshing automatically, or like doing a manual refresh.
Gotcha. Okay. With that, let's take a break here. So is 11:13 here? Let me pause recording. All right. So I've put up a split screen here, kind of just to have both of our components up. So we have the app component, which is rendering a few instances of the message component. So we created a message component, and this is simply returning a hello world inside of the header tag. So our web page with 4 message components should look like this, where we have 4 hello worlds because we have 4 message components being rendered.
Hey, Ankur, I have a quick question.
Yep.
So the app.js file, that can only return 1 item, or can it run multiple functions?
You're saying, can I have another component here?
Yes.
You can have another component. So like if I could call it other, usually this is bad practice, as in you want to put each component into its own file, but you can have multiple components here. This can return, you know, let's just say an H1. You can have multiple components. It's just bad organization from that point. So in this case, you just need to return multiple items. Instead of returning just app, you want to also export other, so that, I guess a better example would be if I put this other inside of here, I could export other also, so that I could use other in here. Does that make sense? So if I exported, what's the syntax here?
The only caveat is that you can only export default 1 item. So you'd have to do.
Let's try again. This is not good practice, but it should be possible. So if I export other, will this work? Let's give that a try. So if I put other here, so now I have my message components, and then I have something called other, which is returning other thing. Let's see if that
So
works.
instead of doing that like that object looking thing with the message and other for the import, couldn't you just like import asterisk and then from the file?
Like this?
Yeah. Oh, I guess not.
Yeah,
Not
Still-
JavaScript.
Okay, so if I do that, save this, there we go. We got other things. So yes, the answer to your question is yes, you can have multiple functions or components in one file, but typically you don't want to do that just from an organizational standpoint. Try to have 1 component per file that you create. But good question. Glad you asked that. But in this case, I'm going to get rid of other because that's not what I want here. Message and go back to message here. Okay, so back to what we had before. I got into the discussion here and I had an incorrect slide, so I apologize for that, but hopefully it's corrected now. We're going to be talking about props and states. So I had these switched. That was my apologies there. But props. Props is short for properties, and properties are what external data values are. So in this case, a parent component will pass properties down to a child component. All right, so those values are called props or properties. Props is the way it's named in React, as in you're going to use a value called props. So that's why I've listed here. And then you have something called state or state values. State values are internal values for a component. That's what the component kind of owns and manages. So if you go back to our OOP discussion, like where you create a class and you have data members, those data members essentially are what state values are. It's just an internal record keeping of whatever values you want to keep. Props, on the other hand, are passed in from some other external component, in this case, a parent component. All right, so just be familiar with this terminology. It's going to come up again and again and again. So props and states, 2 buzzwords that you must know to kind of master React. All right, so let's take a look at the example of how we can actually use props and maybe state values to actually make our application that we're working with a little more exciting. So right now I have hello world repeated 4 times. All right, that's not too exciting. Let's actually make this a little more dynamic. And what I mean by dynamic is so that our code can actually use our component and render different values using the same exact component. So to achieve that, I need to change my component. So I have my parent component, which is app, and my child component in this case is message, because I have message nested within my app component. Here, instead of just returning hello world all the time, I want my parent to be able to tell me or tell this component what to render, right? Because the parent is the one using the message component. The parent should have the ability to kind of control what is put out here. So instead of returning hello world, I'm going to return something else. And this is where it gets, it's kind of knowing the syntax. So here, I'm going to return something called props dot, let's say, greeting. What is props dot greeting? Well, right now, props dot greeting has no value, right? But there's something called props that does exist. So props is a reserved keyword in React. So it's the same thing as like when you use, let. Let is a keyword that is reserved. You can't just use let kind of normal circumstances. It's a reserved keyword, much like function is a reserved keyword, return is a reserved keyword. There's just some reserved keywords within languages. For React, props is a reserved value by that name. I can't use anything else. I can't just say, some properties. This is not going to work the way I want it to. It must be named props.
Did you want to add curly braces around that or no?
Absolutely. All right, so I have something called props.greeting, and this is going to contain some value. But right now, my props doesn't have anything called greeting. The way I would actually pass down a value here is by giving a property here of greeting, and then we'll give it some value. Let's say hello world is our first greeting. All right, so again, very similar to HTML tags that have a tag name and an attribute. In this case, we have a component name and a property that we're going to pass down. So in this case, greeting is what we're going to call it. You can, again, this is effectively like variable naming. You can name it whatever you want to. So in this case, I went with greeting. So I'm going to go greeting, if it's spelled correctly. Let's just say Oscar, Platoon. Awesome. And then a couple other greetings. Let's see, Steven, you popped up on my screen. What's something you want to say to the class here?
My props isn't working.
What is it?
My props isn't working, and that's not the greeting I was supposed to say.
Well, that's fine. That's the green row. Props isn't working. And then greeting, let's just say happy Monday. All right, so now we're passing in a value for greeting, and that's going to be stored in the props. So this props is an object, a JavaScript object that's going to have some values on it. So in this case, .greeting got created from passing it down here. So if I save this and go over here, fail to define, props is not a defined keyword. Well, that's because we need to actually pass it here. All right, so your component can take in a value, and that value is going to be called props. So if I go here, there we go. Hello world, Oscar Platoon is awesome. My props doesn't work. Mistype that. Probably aren't. All right, so we have props here, props.greeting. Okay, so now our parent can actually control what is being passed through. So now this component is more dynamic. We're not hard coding the greeting. The greeting is set by the parent. Question is, can we rename this? Let's see if we can rename this. If I do XX, does that work? I guess that does work. So props is a reserved keyword, I guess, in class-based components, but functional-based components, I guess you're just passing a value. So you can name that whatever you want, but by standards, name it props. Don't try to break convention here. So props are the properties that's an object. So this is an object, a JavaScript object that will have values attached to it. So in this case, we create a greeting, but we can create more properties if we want to also. So let's say I want to say subtext equals my first greeting. All right, so now I added a new property value called subtext. In this case, I could use that here. So I forget who mentioned it, but you do need to have, sorry, I'm having some troubles here. You do need to have parentheses if you're returning more than one value on a new line. So this is one of the quirks of JavaScript. If you add a new line for a return statement, it won't actually process that new line. So if I didn't have these parentheses here, it's going to think I'm returning null here. And then it's going to think that this is like a random line that just exists after my return statement. So it's not actually going to return this item if I don't have parentheses. So this is going to be an error. If your VS Code is working like mine, you should see this line of code kind of grayed out. And that's kind of VS Code telling you, hey, this statement is not going to execute because this return statement is simply going to return on line 4. It's not going to wrap to line 5. This is one of the few cases where semicolons kind of matter. So in this case, JavaScript is automatically adding a semicolon for you here because that's what it thinks you're trying to write here. All right, to get around that, you need to have parentheses so that it could actually return the value on another line. All right, the reason I added this was because I want to add a new div. I'm going to insert my H1 here with props.greeting. But now I have another value called subtext. So if I want to render the subtext as a paragraph, I'll do props.subtext, and it should render that. However, I have a small issue here. Can anyone maybe guess at what my issue might be?
You need to pass in subtext as a parameter. Or, oh, I'm sorry, never mind.
Yep, you're on the right track. So I pass in subtext for my first component of message, but these other ones don't have a subtext value. Well, in that case, subtext is just going to be null. So if I do this, all right, it's fine. It doesn't render anything. So it's not going to be an error, but you don't really have anything shown here. So what if I actually want to conditionally write something? So you can do this in JavaScript or JSX, I guess, where you could check a value and then maybe return something conditionally. So if I want to insert some text here, I could do question mark, break this onto a new line. Sorry, my tabs are a little long. So if I have props.subtext, return props.subtext, else return no subtext was provided. All right, so again, we're doing JavaScript logic here, where we have a ternary statement saying, hey, if props.subtext is something that's not null, just show it. Otherwise, if it's null, let's show some like, not error message, but just some filler text. So we have something that shows us what's going on. So now if I have this here and save it, notice I get no subtext was provided for my other components here.
You
All
didn't you didn't need to nest that text in brackets, right? Was
Here?
that just yeah, where you have no subtext was provided, you have it like in a almost like in a list almost. You
Yeah,
didn't need that, right?
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, that was
Okay.
just for my benefit. You just want to show it's not like a normal message. So that, yep, those are not needed. Okay, so again, you could do conditional logic. Anything between your curly braces, that's effectively JavaScript. So props.greeting, that's a JavaScript object value. This is a ternary statement using this value. So that's what curly braces are used for. So it's a little different than in JavaScript. Curly braces are meant for scope. Here, it's in JSX, it's kind of opening a block for JavaScript logic. Okay, gonna pause there. Any questions about what we added here? I'm gonna make this a little smaller just so it fits, but let me know if it's too small.
So even though the function message doesn't say it takes subtext because it's JavaScript, it gets passed in anyway?
Oh, say that again?
Even though function message doesn't say it takes subtext because it's JavaScript, it gets passed in anyway from app?
It gets passed in through this props object. So this props, again, is an object. Remember, objects are very similar to dictionaries from Python. So props looks like something like this. Props is gonna be greeting, and the value for the first one is gonna be hello world. And then the first, again, I'm talking about the first component here that I'm rendering. is going to
Oh, I
have
see.
subtext here, and then this is going to be my first greeting. So this is what the prop structure looks like, props with an S.
Okay, so the one parameter is everything that's passed in.
Yep. Yeah. So it kind of captures your properties here and then bundles them into an object that you can use within your component. So that's how props are passed down from parent to child for a function-based component. It's just the first parameter for your function.
That's
Right.
weird, but okay, that makes sense.
Good question. But yeah, for our three components out here, subtext is just not going to exist. It's just going to be not in our dictionary. So the props is just going to have a greeting. That's the only value we specified. All right, so this is an example of using props. What do we want to do next? Let's talk about state values. Since we're talking about props, makes sense to talk about state values. State values, if you remember from our slide that's now corrected, they are internal data values for a component. So this is where it gets a little syntactically maybe difficult, but you need to handle states in a very specific way. It's not as simple as doing, hey, let my value equal, 99. This is not a state value. This is just a variable within a component. There's a difference there. So a state value has a very proper, I guess, syntax / handling, as opposed to just creating a value here. This is just a variable. This is not a state value. A state value has a very specific role, I guess. So to create a state value in a function-based component, and this is going to get a little into it, so kind of just accept the syntax. We'll talk more about it on Wednesday. I'm sure Quinn Stevens tomorrow will go over it also. But to actually create a state value, we're going to create a list that's going to have two values in it. I'm going to make it a const value. So the first item is going to be your value. In this case, I'm going to call it my value. The second item in this list is going to be a function that updates your value. So I'm going to call that set my value. This can be named, these two values can be named whatever you want. They're effectively, you're creating a variable and a function. So this, again, by standards, you want to kind of have your function kind of match the name of your variable, but you don't have to. So I can call set my value here. This is totally fine. I'm just creating two values. And then I'm going to set that equal to use state. Right, so this is a function that is a pre-reserved function, use state. It's not something I'm creating. This is something coming from React, so you actually need to import it. So to do that, I'm going to do import use state from React. Right, so notice the syntax here. We're grabbing this use state function from the library, from the React library, and we're using it inside of our component here. Again, the syntax here, very specific. You must follow the syntax, else stuff won't work the way you expect it to.
So yeah, just quick. The use state function returns two values. It's the initial state value as well as a function. So it returns my value and it will return a function called set my value here.
Yep. So again, documentation, always good, especially when you're learning something new. So we go to use state for React, should give us the React. Yep. So there's a use state hook, and you guys can kind of read about this. Again, we're going to go over this a lot more, so kind of just accept it for now. But this is the syntax we're following. So we import from React, and then we create some value and a setter function. In this case, they're creating a value called count. The default value is going to be 0 for count, and then set count will be used when they actually want to update that value. So if I go here, let's say, my value, let's say I want that to equal, let's say subtext. No, let's go my value equals, hello? Yeah, let's go with something. All right, this is the default value for my value. And then if I want to update my value, I need to use this setter. All right, so let's actually render my value here. So I'm going to put a paragraph, another paragraph tag. and just add in my value. Right, so I'm reading the value here, I'm just displaying it, I'm not modifying it. So now I should have the greeting that's passed in by my parent, the subtext that might be passed in by my parent. Again, in some cases we are passing it, other cases we're not, that's totally fine. And then the third paragraph is going to be whatever value I have internal. So again, this is not controlled by my parent, this is controlled internally by my message component. So if I save this, go back here, notice I get something, something, that's the value here, down here, something. Okay, so again, these two items are passed down as props from the parent. This value is a state value that's internal to the component. It is not passed in from the parent. Now, the disclaimer that I came up with before, PSA, we're going to repeat ourselves. Do not modify props or state values by yourself. So don't manually edit it. What I mean by that is, let's say we have our function here. Do not do my value equals new thing. This is bad. Let me make that clear. Bad. Do not modify state values manually. All right. This, you don't want to do that. The reason is React is actually monitoring your prop values and your state values and looking to see if they changed. So again, I think Quincy will probably describe it much more better, but React actually partially updates your page and it trying to track your value. So let's say I change, right? So I did that and I get an error. Assignment to constant variable. That's because I made this const. That's a separate issue. Sorry. All right. What React is doing is, so if I change a value here, let's say I change hello world and add some exclamation marks like this. If I go to my page, it only updated this portion of my page. It actually didn't refresh my entire page. So this is another benefit of React. It makes updating a lot more faster. Instead of the whole page refreshing, when I hit refresh here, all of these items have to be rendered. That can be expensive. So from a software development standpoint, rendering to a screen or input output is very expensive compared to just like doing, logic, like adding two numbers or doing anything you might do with JavaScript or Python. Rendering out to a screen is considered very expensive in terms of time and resources. So you want to avoid that as much as possible, and React kind of makes that possible by whenever you change a value, it's going to investigate the previous state of your output and the new state of your output. It's going to figure out the differences and then only update what changed. And I think that's pretty cool about React, that it can actually do that for you. So it makes it much more efficient to have your web pages rendered. Right. So again, if I change this value, only this value will refresh, not my entire page. All of these items will stay constant and won't actually refresh or update in any manner. It won't re-render to the screen. They'll kind of just be put there. React will say, okay, this changed, let me update that. All right. So again, do not manually edit state and prop values. The reason being is if I try to change my state value like this, React is not going to know that, hey, this value right here needs to be re-rendered. If I changed it, it's not going to know it to re-render it. That's because React expects you to use the setter function to update your state values. So instead of doing this, bad example, the proper way to do it would be, you need to call set my value here, and then pass your new value. Is everyone clear on that? What questions do you guys have about creating state values in function-based components and then updating them?
I have a question. It's semi-off topic, but it has to do with this. So whenever you're not wanting the page to, I guess, re-upload.
Sorry, Alex, your audio is a bit hard for me to pick up.
Can you hear me?
No, I can't hear you.
If you could write your question in the chat, maybe we could answer it there. Sorry, your audio was in and out. But okay, yeah. So again, use the setter function that you create from the use state hook. What's up, Alex?
Am I still breaking up?
No, you sound better now.
Okay, I was saying, as far as worrying about the page reloading, does that have to do with kind of like, say there's a event, so like someone clicks a button or whatever, you don't want the whole page to reload for when they're clicking something, you just want that particular element to
Yep.
pop up or whatever. Is that kind of why this is important?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, if you're constantly refreshing your page, it's not going to look great from the user's perspective. And also, it's going to be more expensive because usually, yeah, as Alex said, you might click a button and that might update like one part of your page. You don't need to refresh the entire page, right? So that's again why React kind of exists. It makes it much more efficient to render things to the screen. Okay, so just to get back to our state discussion, create state values using this use state hook. If you want more detail on it right now, I'd say go to the docs and they have pretty good documentation with examples. So you can read about that, but you got to import use state from the React library, create something similar to this where you have two values in a list. The first item is your actual variable value. The second is your setter function, and use state will return both of them to you. Whatever you pass into use state is your initial value for your variable. And then if you ever need to update it, you update it via the setter function. Okay, so this is an example of function-based components. I mentioned in my slides way back here, we have two types. We have functional-based components and class-based components. So we covered functional-based components at a high level. Again, there's a lot more to it. They get kind of complicated. But we want to talk about class-based components quickly, just to give you that exposure. But again, we're going to get more cracks with both of these.
Ankur?
Yep.
I have a quick question. Is there a way we can programmatically render a bunch of message components dynamically? So if I wanted to render 10 message components in the app.js component, is there a way we can do that?
Absolutely. Glad you asked, Tom. So let's say we want to use, we hard coded 4 instances of the message component. But let's say, we wanted 100. Well, it's probably not going to be efficient for me to copy and paste 100 times. We have other ways to go about that. So since this is JSX, we can use JavaScript to kind of render that for us. So let's actually go about doing that. So I'm going to create a new function called render messages. Now this is the function, render messages. All right, so in here, I'm going to write a for loop. Let I equal 0. Let's do it 100 times. So I less than 100, I plus plus, and yep. So I create a function called render messages. I'm going to take away my messages I had before, and now I'm going to simply call render messages here. So again, this return statement is what ultimately is going to get called. My tabbing is a little screwed up here. So I have a return statement. This is going to execute when this functional component is created for the first time. It's going to return. This return is going to call this function called render messages. So I'm just breaking out my logic into kind of more organized pieces. I could put this for statement, like for loop in here. It's just getting it kind of messy. So instead, I'm going to call a function. This is going to have a for loop, and I'm going to create a bunch of elements. So let's do let elements equal a list, and then I'm going to return that list of elements. All right, so inside here, I'm going to populate elements with my message components. So if I do message, what do I want to do here? Message.
Is it dot append or dot push since it's JavaScript?
Thank you. Main languages. Yep. Dot push. Thank you, Reno. All right, so I'm going to create message components and basically add them to this list and then return the list of elements. Here, let's make our message. What do we want to make a message? We get greeting equals, let's say, I value. All right, so I'm actually going to use my index as part of my message. So if I did that, probably want to do that.
I think you gotta, yeah.
Yep. So again, this is string interpolation. So I could just do message number, and that should print out what are my index values. That's what the greeting is going to be for my component. Right. So if I do it this way, I dynamically kind of create 100 elements, message components, I guess, and I'm going to render that in my app. So if I save this, go here, refresh. React's thinking about something. I'll make sure I didn't screw anything up here. Files. All right, I'm not sure what React's doing, so I'm just going to kill my server. Control C kills it, and then do npm start again. Not sure where my server went out to lunch. Yes, sure. Okay, logos defined, never used, that's fine. So sometimes we might get some warnings. Usually you want to clean those up, but not sure what's going on here. Do I have an infinite loop or something? So I get a for loop plus plus.
Do you want to come out line 11 on message.js?
Message.js.
That might be it.
There we go. Okay, so notice we got all these messages, no subtext for any of them. Something is our state value from the component, but yeah, now we got 100 different message components that rendered. So again, we're just taking advantage of using JavaScript here, where we have a for loop. We're familiar with those, hopefully, and you create JSX elements and then return them from your function.
So how do you use your set my value here for the use state?
Yeah,
function?
what was the point of that? Because it seems like it just messed things up more than it helped.
Yeah, so what actually is happening, so Tom caught the error. So when you update a state value, what's going to happen is that your component is going to re-render. So it's basically React is going to run your functional component again. So what was happening here is when I called set my value here, I'm changing my state value. So it's actually going to call my function again. So I think I was in an infinite loop there where I'm constantly updating a state value, and then my function is constantly getting invoked, and I'm kind of setting an initial value and then changing it each time.
How are you supposed to set your values then?
So you'll want to set your value in another function. So you'll call the function that will call set my value here.
So if I say do something,
You would think that set my value is a function.
It is a function.
so let's make this very specific. It's going to be kind of cheating or hard coding, but let's say if props dot greeting equals say message 4, then I want to change my state value. Right, so if I do something here, I need to return.
I think I'm missing curly braces in your if statement as well.
Yes. I guess in this case, I do something in each case. So call do something and still render my value. I've got it. All right, so when this function executes, it's going to call do something along the way. So again, this is the function. It's going line by line. Doing line 5, going to do line 16. So line 16 will call my function here. The final thing it's going to do is the return statement here. So set my value here is effectively going to update my value. There's more to it. If you guys want the pretty details, it's actually asynchronously updating my value. What I mean by that is if I actually alert here and pop up my value, this should print out, this is going to print out the current value, not the updated value, because this call is asynchronous. Again, probably getting too much into the weeds, so we're going to ignore that. We'll bring that topic up before, but effectively that's going to update my values. If I save this, run it.
I'm
Yes.
glad to see that because that's what I'm getting.
Yeah, I think I'm doing the same thing where I'm always updating. So
Yeah, that needs to be into a use effect, but we'll get that into that
Okay.
later on.
yeah, it's a little more complicated. So use effects.
Wait, what is that?
This is another hook. So we're getting probably more deep than I wanted to. But essentially, this is another way to handle some updating. So this will be called once instead of every time my function is going to render. So this will be triggered one time. Again, the syntax here, very, very foreign. So just, I would say ignore it for now. But my goal here is to call do something the very first time this function is rendered. So if I do this, line 12, use effect missing dependency.
You have to import it.
It's, I think, as a warning. So I have new something here. So that's what I'm sending here. Let's say updated something. So when message equals 4, I want to update something. Otherwise, I'm just going to leave it as something. So that's how a state value is used, where you can internally update a value and show it conditionally. Like I might have more sensible logic where I'm going to want to show a state based on like a user input. So again, if you kind of extend your mind, we're not going to get to this point, I think, in today's lecture. But if a user input something, and based on that, you want to show something conditionally, like if they input 1, maybe you want your font color to be red. If you input 2, you want your font color to be blue. You can do that with in here. So in that case, you need to like set your style value. So if I had style, not style, sorry, class name. You could conditionally set your class name. It could be red or it could be blue, based on whatever like your prop value is. Like if your greeting was something, maybe make it red or blue based on the greeting. Again, you have the flexibility and freedom to do that by using React here. Okay, that covers function-based components. So I do quickly want to touch upon class-based components just to give you guys exposure to it, and we'll go over challenges and get you off to lunch. So function-based components, again, the syntax takes a while to get used to. Use state, use effect. You're gonna be seeing these, but they're a little more advanced. So for today's introductory lecture, let's just kind of not focus on any of that. I do want to go over class-based components, so we'll do that quickly. So I have a function-based component here. What if I want a class-based component? To do that, I'm going to use the syntax for that is a little different. You need to import something called components from React, right? And then message will be my component. So let's actually, I'm going to break this off to another file just so we can see the differences. So give me 1 second. Let's create a new component. Let's call it message x.cs or class.cs. Okay, so I'm creating a class-based component that's going to do the same thing that my function-based component is doing. So get rid of this stuff. And all right, so on my right side here, I have my function-based component. On my left side, I have a class. Like this, class-based component. All right, these are going to do the same exact thing. I just named this message class. Again, this is a naming choice. You don't have to name it with class. I just did that so I can have a different name. Here, message class would be what I export. All right, so similar concept going on here. You need to, in your class, you need to have a method called render. This is the same thing as the return value from your function-based component. Notice I'm returning a div here. So if I copied this and had h1 and then want a greeting, I'm going to have props.greeting in here. Okay, so props.greeting and okay, so message class. So again, just to go over the differences, you need to import something called component. Here we have class, message class extends component. This is effectively inheritance. So if you remember from Python, where you were inheriting from a base class, this extends is effectively saying, I'm taking a base class of component and adding on to it with my message class. So again, if we want to quickly dive into Python, if you remember, like class, message, class. In this case, for Python, you pass in component in the parentheses here. So this is saying, hey, message class is deriving or from the component class. So this is the base class, this is the derived class, or if you want to think about parent class and child class. Same thing going on here. Just different syntax. For JavaScript, you do extends instead of the Python syntax down here. So as I mentioned, class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. That's how you actually create a class, much like class keyword in Python. So we're creating a class called message class, which is based off of the component class. We have a function here called render. One thing I want to point out here is we're not using function keyword. In fact, if you try to use the function keyword, you're going to get an error. The reason is, again, this is probably getting too much into the weeds, but if you remember back in our index.js, it's because of this strict mode right here. Strict mode requires a different syntax for JavaScript. Quinn, I think, might cover it. If not, you might want to read about it. But that's the reason why for my message class, I'm not using function here. It's just the name of my function and then curly braces for that function. This render is a function. It's going to get called automatically by React, and it's going to return whatever I choose to return from that function. All right, so if I save this and go back to my app.js, let me import message class from message class. And now I'm going to comment this out. Here I'm going to render two things. One is going to be a message. And then the other is going to be message class. Again, these are both components doing the same exact thing. We pass in greeting. So let's say this is a functional based component. And this is class based. All right, so before I render this, greeting. For our runners, I want to put up the differences just so we can stare at it a little bit more. Again, we need to return, get rid of this. These two are doing the same exact thing now. One case returning, we just return from our function. The other case for the class-based component, we need a method called render. Must be named render. You cannot say, do render or whatever. It must be called render. It's just one of the particularities. I know it can be frustrating as a new developer, like how do I memorize all these things? Well, with practice, you'll kind of get better at it, but kind of know the name or look up documentation and figure out, hey, I need to call this render so that React will know to actually call this method so it will render out whatever it needs to render. Okay, props is not defined, so I need to actually have props here.
Just props.
Yeah. All right. This. Thank you. Magic keyword. This. This is going into using classes in JavaScript. So not sure we're going to get to that in this lecture, but kind of understanding what this is. If we go back to Python, because hopefully we're more comfortable with Python for classes. If I have class, something. Again, I'm running Python here. If you guys can stay with me. When we had methods like, def my method, we passed in a self keyword. If you guys remember, right? Return self dot value. You guys with me here? You guys remember self keyword? This self keyword.
Following along. This
self keyword is essentially the same thing as what this keyword is in JavaScript. So this is a special keyword. It's a reserved keyword, just like return, just like class. When you use this keyword, or the keyword of this, is going to refer to the instance of message class, right? So we have a class, which is a blueprint. We need to create instances of the message class. So for my app here, I'm creating an instance of message class right here. So this keyword is going to refer to that particular instance, and that particular instance has a specific greeting attached to it. You guys with me? I know that was a lot to kind of process.
No, I'm lost.
So message class is a blueprint to create an object. On line 19, I'm creating an instance of message class. So again, this is terminology from our OOP lecture. So I have something here. This is a blueprint of a class something. When I want to actually create, again, in Python, I create s equals something. This s is an instance of a something class, right? I can create multiple instances if I want. If I want to create s2, there's nothing stopping me from creating multiple instances of the same class. Likewise, in my app.js right here, I'm creating an instance of the message class component on line 19. Right? So when I create an instance, this keyword right here refers to that instance. The same way as in Python, where we have the self keyword, the self refers to the instance of that class that's calling this method. All right, so this is going to have a props object for it automatically, and that's going to be greeting. That's going to have a value of greeting. So in the functional-based component, we pass props as a value to our function, and then we could use that object inside of our function as we want to. For a class-based component, we get this .props automatically passed down to this class, and then we could use the values off of that props. So if I save this, all right, got some warnings, that's fine. I'm not using these items, let's get rid of them. Okay, let's go back here. So notice I rendered two items. This is a functional-based component. This is a class-based component. They're doing the same exact things behind the scenes, but they're just, the syntax form is different. All right, so I'm going to go back to my other screen so we get to stare at it a little more longer. Any questions about class-based components or functional-based components?
For our purpose in class, do you prefer one or the other?
So that's a great question. So as I mentioned before, the new way or the preferred way going forward is going to be functional-based components. So we are probably going to focus on functional-based components a little bit more, but class-based components still are present, like in projects you're working on today. They might be developed with class-based components. So it is very important for you as developers to understand working with either of them. You should be comfortable enough eventually. I'm not saying right now or today you should be, masters of using class-based components or functional-based components, but you should understand the similarities. Like class-based components have a render function. Functional-based components just return what you want to render. Props are passed as a parameter to your function-based component. For your class, this .props is automatically basically exists for your class-based component. All right, so here props, and we use props.greeting. For classes, you got to use this keyword. This is a reference to the instance of the class. You have a props object, and then you have greeting as a value that you created.
Alan, can you toggle back to the apps or app.js page? Just want to see how you call the class component. Just message.
Yep, it's the same exact way.
Okay.
Yep, it doesn't matter how you define the component. The component's called the same exact way. There's no differences there, but good question there.
Okay.
Again, the naming is the naming I chose. You do not have to call it class, whatever you call it, name it whatever you want. Just have it be sensible, hopefully. All right, so that, again, a lot of information, very new to a lot of us. The key things that you should be focusing on: understand the difference between functional-based components and class-based components. Again, the syntax takes a while to get used to. And then also know the difference between props and states. These topics are going to come up again and again. On Wednesday, we are going to focus more on props and states and understand, some of the things that I introduced today. And then we'll be getting more practice with functional-based components and class-based components through just challenges. What questions do you guys have about anything we did today?
Let me see if I get this straight. With message class, when you invoke it, it creates a instance of the class called this. It passes in the value at the end of that line, which is called props, and one of its values is greeting.
Yep. So
And then render is run automatically when that instance is created.
yep. So when React is going to look for a render method, and it's going to run that. For the first time you create your class, it's going to run your render method and return whatever it's trying to render. Anytime it needs to re-render, it's going to call your render method again. So it might need to re-render if something else changed. Like again, if your greeting changes, then your render method is going to be re-ran for that instance. It's not going to create a new component. It's going to use the existing component and rerun the render to update whatever the greeting might be updated to. So again, if you can kind of use your imagination, greeting right now is hard coded, but let's say we had an input value, right? Let's say the user input something, and then we want to show that in our message. We could pass that as a value here. Do you guys want to quickly see that, or do you guys want to kind of get to lunch? First one to speak gets the vote for the class.
Lunch is good.
All right, lunch it is. Okay, we're gonna get a lot more practice. Let's take a look at your challenges, make sure we're prepared for those. So if I go to today's page. All right, so a lot on the curriculum page, you guys can kind of read through it. It's kind of what we went through. I guess we didn't go through on-click handlers, so let's kind of talk about that since it's on the screen here. So, we have button components. We have an event called onClick. Hopefully we've seen this before with our JavaScript days or HTML days. Instead of calling, doing some logic directly, we can call a function that will be invoked. So in this case, we create a function called handle button click. This will be called when you actually click your button. Important thing I want to mention, I kind of forgot to mention earlier. Always, just as a rule of thumb, use anonymous functions. So here we're creating an anonymous function. This will kind of circumvent an issue with, not an issue, but a peculiarity of React, where if you create a function outright, you're going to need to bind that function with your call. Again, I'm throwing terms at you that you guys probably are like, what is he talking about? Just take my word for it. Whenever you create a function handler, create it as an anonymous function so that it'll work properly. There's more details to it, but just kind of go with this structure. So I have a function here that gets, we create here, and then whenever the user clicks this button, this logic will execute. So in this case, it looks like anytime you click a button, it's going to update a state count and then show that state count here. All right, so this is a class-based component, updating state. Again, we do not update states manually. And for a class-based component, we need to use this.set state and then pass it a key value pair of what we want to update. If you do that manually, bad things will happen, as in React won't know how to update your component appropriately. Okay, so let's get to our challenges. Detention is basically getting you practice with using React, but also getting you to practice one of the key rules of React. I will never mutate states or prop directly. So you're gonna be writing that kind of like, if you remember the Simpsons intro where Bart is writing the same statement on a chalkboard 100 times, that's what you're gonna be doing with this challenge. So you're gonna write out, I will never mutate state or props directly. We're gonna ask you to maybe stylize it a little bit. So maybe use some CSS styling, but this should be straightforward. Just, you'll be rendering similar to what I did with messages here. You're rendering a message basically 100 times, and that message should be, I will never mutate state or props directly. All right, notice here, this is a bad example. You should not be setting a state value directly or a props value directly. So that's bad, 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 bad. Props, you should just honor your parents' values and not change them. State values you can change, but you need to do it a very particular way. So if we saw it for a class-based component, you need to do it via this state, this.set state. Okay, other challenges, we have Palindrome. So this is where you're gonna have an input value, and then you should be able to capture that text input. So I think it might be worth going over. So sorry, let me just quickly do this. We have an input ID equals user input. On change is a method. So whenever a user is typing, when they change the value of the input, on change will be triggered. So let's say handle input. This is a functional based component, so I don't need this. So let's say we do an handle input function. Notice I'm not putting parentheses here. You don't want to invoke this function right away. You want to invoke it when they call on change. So handle input is going to be a function, and then this will, let's say, update. Okay, so we have an input. They're going to be able to type something on handle input. Let's actually what do we want to do here? Reading. Let's do an alert quickly. So alerts. So this will take in an event. And then events will have, I think, a target.value. I'm gonna need to double check this. So when they type, handle input is not defined.
Do you need like a let keyword or a const?
Thank you. All right, so we have our function there. We have an input. Notice we get a T because I typed a T. Let's type in O. All right, so basically when this on change event happens, it's going to pass you an event object. So you're going to read documentation, kind of understand what that event looks like for on change. In that case, event.target.value is going to be the value that it changed to. So in that case, I'm throwing up an alert value. But let's say instead of an alert, I want to actually change my message here. How do I do that? I promise this will be the last example. I know you guys want to get to lunch. So what I'm going to do.
Setter.
Yeah, but I need to update this greeting value. So what I'm going to do is create a state value. If you guys remember briefly from our example, I want to create a state value. So I'll do const greeting and set greeting.
I got ahead of myself.
Set my greeting. And that's going to be equal to use state. And let's say the initial value is empty. You need to import use state. Sometimes VS Code does it for you, but don't always rely on VS Code doing it for you. So import use state from React. I'm setting the initial value to empty string. This is going to give me back my initial value and the setter function. So let's say when the user enters a value, I'm going to update my greeting. So set my greeting to event.target.value. So now whenever the user types something, my handle input's going to fire, and it's going to update my greeting value. So my greeting is my variable name. I have a setter function of set my greeting. That's the second value here. So that's a function where I pass in the new value, and it's going to update the current value of my greeting. Again, last time, I'll say this for today, hopefully, you do not want to do something like this. This is bad. I don't know how many bads I need to write here. You don't directly want to update state values or prop values. So do not do this. Oops. Don't do that. You want to call the setter function. So that's going to update this. And now for my greeting here, instead of hard coding it, what if I just put in my greeting here, right? So now the first component's greeting value is going to be tied to this internal state value. So whenever that value changes, React will automatically re-render this message component and use that new greeting. So if I want to see this in play, let's go here. Notice it's empty right now. If I type T, there we go, is Monday. So this is that message
Yeah, that's
component.
pretty cool.
This is that message component being rendered by taking a user input. Again, just walk through those steps one more time so we're good with it. We have an input field right here. This on change is a pre-created event that's going to happen, as in when a user types in something, on change will fire. That's the event associated with that. When that fires, it's going to call handle input and pass it some event object. It's going to have a bunch of goodies in it. There's a lot of information packaged in this events object. One of those items are what the actual value is of the input field. So given that, we can capture the new value. We can set our greeting to it. The greeting is a state value in our app component. Okay, so state value. We're taking that state value from the app component. We're updating it on line 21. Because on line 27, we're mapping my greeting to our message component here. We're passing that down as a prop now. So my greeting is going to be the new prop. So if I go back to my message component over here, anytime that this changes, React is going to say, okay, props.greeting is a new value. Let me re-render this portion or this component. Make sense? So again, kind of understand the difference between props and states. State values are internal. So I have an internal value of my greeting in my app component, but that's actually going to pass down a copy of that as a prop to the message component. So the message component can use that prop to display the greeting. Okay, that hopefully was a good enough introduction to React. Let's complete the challenges that we want to go over. So detention, again, very simple React challenge, just rendering something out to the screen. Palindrome, it's going to require some input. So it's similar to what we just did here, where we capture user input, through an input field, and then use that value to check if something is a palindrome or not. So again, in Palindrome, a word that's the same back and forth. So basically, a user will enter a word, and you need to tell the user, hey, this is a palindrome or this is not a palindrome. The last challenge is a state abbreviator. This is where we're going to have you create like a dropdown, and that dropdown should have like the state abbreviations like MI or WI or IL for Illinois, and you should show the full state name. So if I select CA from my dropdown, that should show me California in some output on the screen. So that's what state abbreviator is asking you to do. So that dropdown again is going to be user input where they change the value. You're going to have to figure out how to grab that value when it changes, and then use that value to look up some other information so that you could show California when the user selects CA from the dropdown. All right, so again, these challenges will give you good practice. Might be difficult. Again, first time, probably most of you guys are working with React. So it's fine if you get stuck, just ask for help in the afternoon or from evening TAs. Reading documentation, again, half the name of the game for half the battle is reading documentation.
So there's a drop-down component?
There's a drop-down element for HTML.
You have to, yeah.
HTML drop-down, I think it's
Select
the select tag. So yeah, I don't think we probably didn't cover this in HTML week, but just read the W3 schools page and you should pretty much be good to go. But create a select element with options, and that'll be a drop-down.
And think about how you can programmatically render the option tag multiple times.
Yep. So you usually want to hard code, for the states, there's 50 states, but what if they're like you want to do it for cities or zip codes or something? You probably don't want to hard code each of those yourselves. So if you had some data and then use that data to render these components, it'd be much easier for you to do that.
Wasn't there like a .inner HTML?
There is a .inner HTML, but that doesn't work for dropdowns.
So
I mean,
when
for appending. Go ahead.
Oh, gotcha. Well, I think going off Tom's suggestion, I would probably create a parent select element, and then you probably use a for loop to create your child elements if you have your data in some data set, like a object or list or whatever it might be. Sorry, object or array in JavaScript.
I think Don had a question.
What's up, Don?
when we created our app a while ago, we had this 5-minute download. Has that installed somewhere where it's gonna be there, or is that gonna happen every time?
You're gonna run npx create React app and your app name each time, and then it's gonna download your React libraries for that project. So it's hopefully it doesn't take 5 minutes each time. You're gonna depend on your internet speed, but for me it took about a minute. It is a bit of wait time, but you're gonna have to do that each time for your React projects. Okay, guys. As always, please reach out in the Oscar questions chat this afternoon. Let me